It was a quiet Friday morning in North Hollywood. The sun was out and people were just starting their day, going to work, running errands, or heading to the bank. No one had any idea that their ordinary morning was about to turn into, well, a war zone. At 9:17 a.m., two men wearing black ski masks and heavy body armor walked into the Bank of America on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. These guys were not your ordinary bank robbers. They were armed for a battle. Their names were Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matassarianu, and they were about to unleash a level of violence that America had really never seen before on its own streets. The chaos was just beginning. Within minutes, the first police cars arrived. The officers inside thought they were responding to a standard bank robbery. But they were wrong, very wrong. As soon as they got there, Phillips and Matassarianu opened fire. The sound of automatic weapons echoed through the neighborhood. The police were armed with standard 9mm pistols and shotguns. It was like bringing knives to a gunfight. Their bullets just bounced harmlessly off the robbers' body armor. The robbers' bullets, on the other hand, tore through police cars, walls, and basically anything else in their path. The officers were trapped, outgunned, and desperately calling for backup. Above the chaos, news helicopters swarmed like vultures. Their cameras broadcast the entire event live to the world. People all across Los Angeles and honestly the nation watched in horror. They saw police officers pinned down. They saw civilians running for their lives. The live feed showed the two robbers, dressed like soldiers, calmly walking and firing their military-grade weapons. It was a terrifying spectacle. The news anchors didn't even know what to say. They had never witnessed anything like this before. It felt like watching a movie, but the danger was very, very real. The city of Los Angeles held its breath, glued to the television screen. This wasn't just a robbery anymore, it was a siege. The two men had turned a busy commercial street into their own personal battlefield. For 44 agonizing minutes, they held the Los Angeles Police Department at bay. They fired over 1,100 rounds of ammunition. They injured 11 police officers and 7 civilians. The scene was just pure pandemonium. The live broadcast made it clear that something was terribly wrong with how law enforcement was equipped to handle threats like this. This single event would forever change the face of American policing. It was a brutal, bloody lesson learned in the most public way possible. To really understand the violence of that day, you have to understand the men behind the masks. Larry Eugene Phillips Jr. was the mastermind. He was born in 1970 and grew up in a fractured home. His father, Larry Phillips Sr., was a career criminal. Crime was, well, in his blood. From a young age, Larry Jr. was exposed to a life outside the law. He learned about guns, scams, and how to stay one step ahead of the police. He was not a man who respected rules or authority. He saw society as something to be taken from, not contributed to. This mindset was the foundation for the violence he would later unleash. Phillips was intelligent, but he used his mind for crime. He was a con artist and a thief. In his late teens, he was already involved in real estate fraud. He was good at it too. He could manipulate people and systems to get what he wanted. But simple scams weren't enough for him. He craved more. He was fascinated with weapons and military tactics. He spent hours studying how to build bombs and modify firearms. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a student of destruction. He believed that overwhelming firepower was the key to success in any criminal enterprise. This belief would define his entire criminal career. His criminal record started early. He was arrested for theft and fraud, but he often managed to avoid serious jail time. He was slippery. He knew how to work the system he despised. However, his crimes began to escalate. He started getting involved in armed robberies. He saw them as a faster, more direct way to get the money he felt he deserved. He was not afraid of confrontation. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it. He believed that violence and intimidation were tools of the trade. For Larry Phillips Jr., a gun wasn't just for threatening people, it was for eliminating any and all resistance. Phillips was a man with a dangerous philosophy. He believed he was smarter and tougher than the police. He saw law enforcement as an obstacle to be overcome with superior force. This wasn't just about money for him, it was about power. It was about proving he could beat the system. He was preparing for war long before the North Hollywood shootout. He was collecting weapons, studying police procedures, and looking for a partner who shared his vision. He was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown had already begun. All he needed was the right accomplice to help him light the fuse. Emil Matassarianu was the muscle of the operation. He was a stark contrast to Phillips. Born in Romania in 1966, He moved to the United States with his family when he was just a child. He grew up in Altadena, California. Unlike Phillips, he didn't come from a family of criminals. His mother was a devout churchgoer. Emil was a big kid, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing close to 300 pounds. He was quiet and withdrawn. He struggled with health problems, including epilepsy, which eventually led to a brain tumor diagnosis. He dreamed of opening his own business, a home care facility for the mentally ill, but his plans just never worked out. His life was, honestly, a series of failures. His business attempts failed, his personal relationships crumbled, he felt like an outcast. He was looking for a purpose, for a way to feel powerful and in control. He found that purpose when he met Larry Phillips Jr. They met at a Gold's Gym in Venice, California back in 1989. Phillips was charismatic and confident. He offered Matasareanu a vision of success and power that he had never known. Phillips saw Matasareanu's size and desperation as assets. He could mold him into the perfect partner in crime. Matasareanu, desperate for direction, was easily influenced. Together, they were a dangerous combination. Phillips was the brain, the planner. Matasareanu was the enforcer, the loyal soldier. Matasareanu shared Phillips's interest in firearms and weightlifting. They spent hours together, training and planning. Phillips's radical anti-authority views rubbed off on Matasareanu. He began to see the world through Phillips's eyes. The system was the enemy. The police were the enemy. The only way to win was to be stronger and more ruthless than everyone else. He became a follower, committed to Phillips's violent ideology. His own dreams faded away, replaced by Phillips's dark ambitions. Matasareanu's transformation was complete. The quiet, struggling young man was gone. In his place was a heavily armed criminal, ready to follow Phillips into battle. He had a family, including a young son, but his loyalty was to Phillips and their criminal enterprise. He invested his time and money into buying weapons and equipment. He helped Phillips plan bigger and bolder heists. He was no longer just a follower, he was a willing participant in a conspiracy that would end in a hail of gunfire on the streets of North Hollywood. His search for purpose had led him down a path of destruction. In the early 1990s, Los Angeles had a reputation. It was known as the bank robbery capital of America. It was a city under siege by criminals. In 1992 alone, there were over 2,600 bank robberies in the city. That's more than 10 robberies every single business day. It became honestly almost routine. Robbers would walk into a bank, pass a note to a teller, and walk out with a few $1,000s. Most of these crimes were quick and non-violent. The robbers wanted to get in and out without attracting attention. The police and the public became almost numb to the constant stream of robberies reported on the news. Banks were seen as easy targets. They were everywhere, and they were full of cash. The strategy for many banks was simple: cooperate. Tellers were trained to hand over the money without a fight. The goal was to avoid violence and protect the lives of employees and customers. The amount of money stolen in a typical robbery was relatively small, often less than what a bank would spend on enhanced security. So for a time, banks just accepted these robberies as a cost of doing business. This created a perfect environment for criminals. The risk was low, and the reward was immediate. But the police and the FBI were not going to let this continue. They started to fight back. They formed special task forces dedicated to catching bank robbers. They used surveillance photos and witness descriptions to track down suspects. They worked with banks to improve security. Die packs were hidden in stacks of cash, designed to explode and stain the money and the robber. Silent alarms were installed to alert police the moment a robbery began. The message was clear: robbing a bank in Los Angeles was not going to be easy anymore. The authorities were drawing a line in the sand. The government also stepped up the pressure. They passed tougher laws with longer prison sentences for bank robbery. A simple note job that once might have resulted in a few years in prison could now lead to decades behind bars. The stakes were getting higher. The age of the casual, non-violent bank robbery was coming to an end. This crackdown was meant to deter criminals. It was meant to make them think twice before walking into a bank. But for some criminals, like Larry Phillips and Emil Matasareanu, it had the opposite effect. It didn't scare them. It made them more dangerous. So, the new security measures and tougher laws did work, but, not exactly in the way everyone hoped. The number of bank robberies definitely went down. The amateur criminals, the ones just looking for a quick and easy score, were deterred. They figured the risk just wasn't worth the reward anymore. But then, a new breed of robber started to appear. These were hardcore, committed criminals. They weren't afraid of long prison sentences, mostly because they had no intention of ever being caught. For them, the increased security wasn't a deterrent, it was more like a challenge. So, if the banks and police were going to fight back, these robbers decided they'd fight back even harder. This led to a really dangerous escalation. Robberies became way more violent. Instead of quietly passing a note, these new robbers would storm into banks with guns drawn, shouting and threatening everyone inside. They wanted to control the situation through fear and intimidation. They didn't want to give anyone a chance to press a silent alarm or activate a die pack. And yeah, they were more organized and a whole lot more ruthless. This was the era of the so-called takeover robbery. The criminals would take control of the entire bank, holding everyone hostage until they got what they wanted. The risk of violence and death just skyrocketed. Criminals like Phillips and Matasareanu studied the new security systems. They figured out how to defeat them. They timed police response times, knew exactly how long it would take for the first officers to arrive, and planned their robberies with almost military precision. They were no longer just simple thieves, they were tactical operators. They understood that to succeed, they needed to be better prepared and better armed than the police. So, they started acquiring more powerful weapons and protective gear. The goal wasn't just to get the money anymore. The goal was to survive any confrontation with law enforcement. This, created a vicious cycle. As the robbers became more violent and better armed, the police had to respond in kind. But, honestly, they were always one step behind. Standard police officers were still carrying pistols and shotguns, while the most dangerous criminals were arming themselves with assault rifles. Basically, the criminals were setting the terms of engagement. They were dictating the level of violence. And the North Hollywood shootout was the ultimate expression of this deadly trend. It was the terrifying culmination of years of escalating violence, where the criminals finally had a massive advantage in firepower over the police. The partnership between Larry Phillips and Emil Matasareanu grew stronger with each crime they committed. They started with smaller armored car robberies before moving on to banks. Their first major score together was in Denver, Colorado in 1993. They hit an armored car and got away clean. This success really fueled their ambition. They saw themselves as professionals, a step above the common street thugs. They reinvested their stolen money into better equipment. They bought illegal firearms, ammunition, police scanners, and body armor. They were building, an arsenal for a private war against society. Their crimes became more audacious and more violent. In 1995, they robbed an armored car in Littleton, Colorado, killing a guard in the process. This was a turning point. They had crossed a line from robbery to murder. There was no going back. They knew that if they were ever caught, they would face the death penalty or life in prison. This made them even more desperate and more dangerous. They had nothing to lose. They adopted a philosophy of do or die. They would rather die in a shootout with police than spend the rest of their lives in a cage. They continued their crime spree in the Los Angeles area. In May 1996, they hit 2 different Bank of America branches in the San Fernando Valley in quick succession. They used the same takeover style. They stormed in with overwhelming force, terrorizing employees and customers. They got away with over $1.5 million, but their luck was starting to run out. During one of their getaways, a die pack exploded, ruining most of the cash. This was a major setback. They were left with a pile of useless, stained money. They were angry, frustrated, and more determined than ever to pull off one last massive score. This frustration led them to plan the North Hollywood heist. It was meant to be their biggest payday ever. They believed the Bank of America on Laurel Canyon Boulevard held a large amount of cash, possibly up to $750,000, especially on a Friday before the weekend. This was going to be the robbery that set them up for life. They put all their resources and planning into this one job. They were not just planning a robbery, they were planning a military-style operation. They were ready for a fight. In their minds, they were soldiers going into battle, and they were prepared to kill anyone who got in their way. The plan for the North Hollywood robbery was meticulous. Phillips, the strategist, had studied every detail. He chose the Bank of America on Laurel Canyon Boulevard for a specific reason. He mistakenly believed that because it was the end of the month, the bank would have a larger than usual amount of cash on hand. He calculated their entry and exit routes. He timed the robbery to happen at 9:15 a.m., just after the bank opened, hoping to catch them off guard. He even took a muscle relaxant, phenobarbital, before the robbery to calm his nerves. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated act of war. Their equipment was chosen for one purpose: maximum destruction. They had multiple weapons, including illegally modified AK-47 style rifles. These were fully automatic military weapons, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. They also had a Bushmaster AR-15 and a Beretta 92F pistol. They carried thousands of rounds of ammunition in vests and drum magazines. Their bullets were steel-core, armor-piercing rounds. They were designed to penetrate standard police body armor and even car doors. This wasn't just for show. They fully intended to use this firepower against anyone who tried to stop them. Their most critical piece of equipment was their body armor. They wore heavy, custom-made suits of armor that covered their entire torsos, from their necks to their thighs. The armor was made of aramid, a material similar to Kevlar, reinforced with steel trauma plates. This armor could stop handgun and shotgun rounds with ease. It made them seem invincible, like something out of a science fiction movie. They were walking tanks. They knew the police would shoot at them, and they had prepared for it. The armor gave them the confidence to stand their ground and fight, knowing that most police weapons would be useless against them. On the morning of February 28, 1997, they put their plan into action. They drove to the bank in a white Chevrolet Celebrity. They synchronized their watches. They put on their black ski masks and heavy armor. They looked like something out of a nightmare. As they walked toward the entrance of the bank, they set their car alarm. It was a signal. They had a set amount of time to get the money and get out before the police response would become overwhelming. They thought they had planned for every contingency, but they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the courage of the LAPD. The moment the first shots were fired, it was clear this was an unfair fight. The responding LAPD officers were armed with their standard-issue Beretta 92 f9mm pistols, and some had 12-gauge shotguns. These weapons are effective for typical police work. They are reliable for stopping an average unarmored suspect. But against Phillips and Matasareanu, they were practically useless. The officers' handgun bullets flattened on impact against the robbers' heavy body armor. They might as well have been throwing rocks. The officers watched in disbelief as their shots had no effect on the two heavily armed men. In stark contrast, the robbers' firepower was devastating. Their fully automatic rifles fired armor-piercing rounds that sliced through police cars as if they were made of paper. Engine blocks, car doors, and laminated safety glass offered no protection. The officers were forced to take cover behind trees and concrete walls, anything that could possibly stop the high-velocity bullets. The sound of the automatic gunfire was deafening and relentless. It created a kill zone around the bank, pinning down the police and preventing them from mounting any kind of effective counterattack. They were completely and totally outgunned. The situation was desperate. The police were fighting a losing battle. They were facing a military-style assault with handguns. As more officers arrived, the scene only grew more chaotic. They too were armed with the same inadequate weapons. The robbers, protected by their armor, were able to walk calmly through the parking lot, firing at will. They had complete control of the battlefield. The live news coverage showed the world this terrifying imbalance of power. It was a stark and brutal demonstration that American police were not prepared for this new level of criminal warfare. Realizing their weapons were useless, the police made a desperate call. They needed more firepower. They requested that SWAT teams respond immediately. In a move that would become legendary, some officers ran to a nearby gun store, B&B Sales, to borrow more powerful weapons. They deputized the store's rifles, taking AR-15s and other semi-automatic long guns back to the front lines. This was an unprecedented act born of sheer desperation. Finally, they had weapons that could potentially penetrate the robbers' armor. The tide of the battle was about to turn, but not before many more shots were fired, and many more lives were put at risk. The North Hollywood shootout ended in blood and death. Larry Phillips, wounded by police and realizing he was cornered, took his own life. Emil Matasareanu, after a long and brutal gun battle, was shot multiple times in his unprotected legs by the newly armed officers and the arriving SWAT team. He bled to death on the street. The 44-minute war was over, but the impact of that day was just beginning. The event served as a massive, horrifying wake-up call for law enforcement agencies across the entire United States. The rules of engagement had changed forever. The primary lesson was about firepower. Police departments realized that their officers could no longer be sent into dangerous situations armed with only a sidearm. The shootout directly led to a nationwide trend of equipping patrol cars with high-powered rifles, typically AR-15s or similar models. The idea was to give patrol officers, who are almost always the first to arrive on a scene, the ability to match the firepower of heavily armed criminals. This policy change was a direct result of the helplessness felt by the LAPD officers, whose pistols were useless against the robbers' armor and rifles. The shootout also highlighted the importance of body armor for both criminals and police. Phillips and Matasareanu's ability to absorb dozens of rounds showed the effectiveness of heavy armor. In response, police departments began to upgrade the body armor issued to their officers, providing better protection against rifle rounds. Tactics also changed. Police training evolved to include scenarios involving active shooters and heavily armed suspects. The concept of surround and contain was reevaluated. The new thinking emphasized moving quickly to neutralize the threat, a tactic that is now standard in active shooter responses. The legacy of the North Hollywood shootout is written in the policies and procedures of every police department in America today. It was a tragic and violent day, but it forced a necessary evolution in law enforcement. It exposed a critical vulnerability and forced police to adapt to a more dangerous world. The bravery of the officers that day, who stood their ground while being completely outgunned, is a testament to their dedication. The shootout remains a powerful reminder that the forces of law and order must always be prepared for the worst, because as we saw on February 28, 1997, the worst can happen at any time.